Hello, everyone. Welcome to Grace Every Day, a podcast to help Christian wives of blue collar guys get healthier and happier. Today's podcast episode is the second in sort of a little mini series that I'm doing on change, what to do when change happens and how to leverage it. And if you haven't heard, listen to, or watch the first episode, last week's episode, go back and listen to that or watch it if you're watching this on YouTube. It just came out last week, and today's episode is kind of going to build on the foundation of what I shared in last week's episode. So specifically today, we're going to talk about why some people resist change and what happens when we do. And I don't know if you're like me, if you're one of those people, like I'm one of those people that I really love change when it's my idea. But naturally, just, as a personality, I don't just love change, again, unless it's my idea. Some of us are more hardwired to just, like the idea of change a little more. And some of us are hardwired to like change just a little less. The majority of people that I meet don't really like change. But again, most of us either have a little more inclination to get excited about change, and some of us don't. So it's not a bad thing or to be one way or the other, but just being aware of your natural inclination, and then again, just being willing to grow right from that. So resistance to change will vary, right? From different people, from situation to situation. Some people lean into change and adapt more quickly, and some people, just like Mac, downright enjoys change. And others don't want change of any kind in any way, and won't change anything at all, even if they are just absolutely forced to. They're just going to go kicking and screaming, right? Now, what's interesting is that we often see this and recognize this in other people's lives, but it's more difficult to be aware of it for ourselves. And so I've certainly seen people over the years where I can see they didn't embrace change, they didn't want to adapt to change, and I can see how that cost them in their career. But it's much more difficult to look in the mirror than it is to look out the window, right? It's always easier for us to see other people and what they should do different, and then not always recognize what we need to do different. So a lot of times when it comes to resistance of change, it's because we fear the unknown. As humans, most of us fear the unknown. Obviously, not everybody is completely that way, but the majority of people don't like the unknown. They don't like uncertainty because uncertainty can bring the possibility that you're not going to like the future state. And so it's interesting because a lot of times we limit ourselves just out of that fear of, what if I don't like the change as much as I like the current situation? So therefore I'm going to resist the change. And in doing so, we are often limiting ourselves, our potential, and our opportunities. You've probably heard the expression, but better the devil you know than the devil you don't, right? And to me, that's just saying, well, even if I'm miserable in this situation, I know what the situation is, so I'll just stay here. And that is tragic, because I know a lot of people who are unhappy, who need to make some changes, either at home or at work, personally or professionally, but they just have that refusal to change. And so they're missing out on change bringing improvement. As Max says, without change, there can be no improvement. But a lot of times we are stuck and resisting the change. And so we stay in that known situation, even if it's not the best choice. Now, again, some of us are a little more hardwired to appreciate just more structure and stability. Just more of a routine and less of flipping everything out and throwing the fruit basket turnover and seeing what you get. But I've learned it's important to embrace change when it happens, because like I talked about last week, is change often can bring the opportunity when we are looking for it. Now, everyone experiences, I think, a little bit of resistance to change in some area of life. Maybe it's not moving to a new state that gets you uncomfortable. Maybe it's changing your career. Interesting that I had a friend of mine recently who has been in the same career for 18 years, and she just realized personally she was ready for a change. But she tells me, she's like, I don't really like change, but she recognized that making a change in her career would bring her a lot more joy and, in her day-to-day work, and a lot more satisfaction. And so it took amazing courage, but super proud of her for just being willing to stay, to switch careers after 18 years. That's incredibly brave. And it comes with some risk, right? What if she made the change and, resigned from a job and shifted into a new career and didn't like it? That's certainly a possibility. So it takes a lot of courage to embrace the change and say, you know what, I'm going after this change intentionally because I know it's going to benefit me emotionally or career wise, or just, again, bring more joy and satisfaction to that daily, the work that she's doing. And it's interesting because a lot of people I know wouldn't have had the courage to make that change. So I want to talk about the three reasons that some of us resist change. And sometimes resistance of change is based on a real good, a valid reason. Like, I don't like to change things like the running shoes that I wear very much, because I kind of know what works for me in running, and I don't want to risk buying, $120 pair of shoes and then they rub a blister the wrong way. So sometimes that's not an unhealthy resistance to change. It's just being mindful of when it's okay to resist change. What changes do we need to resist, and which ones do we need to embrace, right? So being intentional about that, not just resisting all change or grabbing all change, but being mindful and being intentional of, does this change serve me? Does this bring an opportunity? Let me look for that. So, again, sometimes there are valid reasons to be cautious when change happens. But most of the time we get so stuck in our routines and our ways and our habits that we stop looking for the opportunities of change, or we stop intentionally making change happen, and then we stagnate, right? Life is full of changes, life is full of seasons, and as people, if we are not growing, we're slowing down, right? If we're not growing and bringing change intentionally to our own mindset and to our own growth, then we are slowing, because you're either doing one or the other. You're either moving forward in life or you're moving backward, but you cannot be going both directions at the same time. So 3 reasons that some of us resist the change. Number 1, change can be uncomfortable. Anytime we are changing, we have to get outside of the comfort zone, get into the growth zone, and we have to leave behind the familiar and deal with some of the unknown. And the unknown there again can benefit us. You might like it better in the long run, but in the short term, change can be uncomfortable. Change forces us to cross the gap between one behavior and another, one way of doing something and another, one way of responding to a situation and another. And that growth can often be uncomfortable. And so a lot of times people resist change because they are not comfortable with the uncomfortable. It's Neil Donald Walsh who says, life begins at the end of your comfort zone. Well, I don't know if life begins at the end of your comfort zone, but growth certainly does. And a lot of times we find ourselves being resistant to change because we don't want to be uncomfortable, and we are therefore limiting our potential because we're not willing to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Status quo will get you nowhere. Number 2, change is not easy. The reason that change isn't easy is because anytime we are changing, we have to put a lot more energy into the situation. It might be learning new skill set. It might be your work changes computer program software, and now you have to learn how to deal with the new software, and it takes more effort. It takes more energy. It's not easy to do, right? Something as simple as updating your phone. And now, your apps are different, or the phone itself operates differently. And so you have to put a lot more conscious thought and energy into dealing with the change. And this could be any change, right? At home or at work. If you just rearrange your furniture. I remember a couple of years ago, Mac has always wanted a sort of an ottoman at the foot of the bed. And so a couple of years ago, I finally was like, okay, great, I'm going to buy an ottoman because he's always wanted one, has always asked for it. And so finally I go and I get an ottoman for the foot of the bed. And, that's just another piece of furniture that you have to walk around. And so you have to remember when you get up in the middle of the night, it's dark, you got to remember to walk around it. Well, a couple of times we both sort of stumbled on it into the dark. And Mac was like, we probably should just move that. And I'm like, no, you've always wanted one. And now I finally bought one, and I've already bought it at this point, right? I've spent money on it. And then a couple of days later, I got up in the middle of the night, and instead of walking around it, I ran into it and broke one of my toes. Just smacked right into it in the dark, not remembering that it's there. And, there again, that's just a little example. But when something changes, when something shifts, it's not easy because we have to put a lot more conscious thought, time, effort, and energy into dealing with the change. We're not just in that pattern or that routine that is familiar. If it's changes on the job, it might be new skills you have to use your thought, processes for, and your brain is just natural. Our human being's brain is wired to be comfortable, because thinking requires energy. And so your brain, your body just says, well, we don't want to waste energy. So we don't want to have to use that time and energy if we don't have to. And that's just, physiologically how our brain, it says, oh, let's preserve energy. But when we get outside that comfort zone and those patterns and those routines, and we're growing, again, we are growing as humans, emotionally, mentally, and that's not easy, but it's always worth it. And the number three, the third reason that a lot of people resist change is because it requires risk. And I just barely touched on this, but most of us have a little bit of just an aversion to risk. We just, to some degree or the other, some of us are more willing to take on risks, and some of us are less willing to take on risks. The interesting thing I think that I find is that more women are less willing to take on large risks than men. And I don't know if that is just biologically something that we're wired towards one tendency or another, but I would say that most of the women I know tend to have a little more aversion to just taking big risks than more of the men that I know. And that's just my perspective. It'd be interesting to see if there's some research out there on that. Maybe I should look for that. Now, and there are people who, like the man who climbed the skyscraper a couple of months ago, and his name is escaping me now, but no rope, no harness, no safety net, nothing. Like, he just climbs that skyscraper, and mountain climbing and all of that with, again, no rope, nothing to catch him if he falls. Just, that's an incredible risk, right? My mind would be like, absolutely not. I'm not getting 20 feet off of the ground, much less hundreds of feet off of the ground, without being, harnessed in or having a safety net or something. Is what if I slip and fall? So I am not interested in taking big risks like that. Now, little risks, maybe smaller risk or comfortable risks, but life-threatening, potentially life-ending risks, I am very, very cautious when it comes to that. So I think most humans have at least some level of an aversion to risk, different kinds of risk. Some people might be less averse to taking a risk if it's something like mountain bike racing. Like when Mac and I used to mountain bike race, there are some people who didn't mind like riding right on the edge of your skills and you might crash. I tend to be a little less willing to do that, but certainly there were times when I did crash and got hurt. But to, some people might be more comfortable with that risk, but they're not willing to take like a financial risk. And so it's interesting how every one of us are a little bit different, but that's the third reason that people resist change a lot of times, is because change requires risk. Now, as a rule, we don't mind risking often in life if the risk is small or low. And we don't mind risking as much when the potential gain is big. So, but somewhere in that scale, most of us have a spectrum of this risk is okay, this risk is not, right? And that's going to be different for every single one of us. But change always brings about that risk because we might not like that new situation as much as we liked the old one, right? That's why a lot of people just won't change jobs. They're like, well, what if I don't like it as much as I like this one? Or even if they're miserable, they're unhappy, they just don't want to deal with the change. And so they don't want to risk, right? That future outcome might not be as good. So, just being mindful of that and being mindful of the opportunities that are coming our way and we are missing out because we are not willing to change. Romans 12:2 reminds us, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of the mind. And to me, that's just a great reminder of don't copy the behavior of everyone else, right? Be not conformed to this world says don't go along with status quo just because everybody else is. And renewing our mind is just a good reminder that we can shift our mindset, and when we do, it brings so many good potential opportunities. So if we're just resistant to change for the sake of keeping things the same, number one, we make the mistake of missing out in life. We're staying in situations too long, relationships too long, jobs too long. We stay in places too long and we become complacent or stagnant, and again, we're missing out on the opportunities in life. I remember many years ago, I was working in an organization, and our organization acquired a smaller organization, which is, pretty common. And I was going over to sort of onboard and train some of the employees that we were, kind of adopting. And one of the ladies was like, I think I'm just going to go ahead and retire. She's like, I don't want to have to learn a new computer system. I don't want to have to learn new policies and new HR things and, just new way of doing things. And she was basically just saying, well, rather than change, I'm just going to quit. I'm just going to retire. She's like, I'm just going to go on, and rather than deal with the change, it's going to be a big change and I don't want to deal with it. So I'm just going to quit. And everyone, again, has to make that decision for themselves. But she certainly missed out on some of the incredible opportunities that the change brought. It did bring new opportunities for growing in the careers, in her career, that she could have moved on up and gotten a new position, gotten a pay raise, right? But rather than deal with the stress of change, she was just like, nope, I'm just gonna quit. And again, just another example of how sometimes we find ourselves dragging when it comes to change, but remembering to embrace change and look for the positives can help us take advantage and leverage change when it happens. Remember, life is tough, but God's grace is always enough. Until next time.